Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Max Margulies and I am the Research Director at the Modern War Institute at West Point. I'd like to welcome you all to today's War Council, which will focus on the recent developments with respect to security in the Indo-Pacific and a number of specific events in the news over the last couple months that suggest a rise in tensions between the US and China. As usual, our MWI War Council series is designed to connect members of the West Point community with leading experts who can provide context for contemporary events of importance to national security. We have an exciting and interdisciplinary lineup of speakers for you today. Before I introduce them, I would like to remind everyone that the views expressed in this panel are the personal views of the panelists and not of the US government or any of the panelists' employers, as well as the fact that we are recording today's panel so that we can later make it available on MWI platforms. Without further ado, I will introduce each panelist, who will then share a few minutes of prepared remarks based on their area of expertise. After that, we'll open it up to question and answers from the audience. So today we are joined by Major Brigid Calhoun, who is a non-resident fellow at the Modern War Institute and a military intelligence officer who has published on great power competition and American national security. She currently serves in the Office of the Deputy Secretary of Defense. We also have Justin Lynch, also an MWI fellow and a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He has worked at a number of governmental positions, including the House Armed Services Committee, the Office of Science and Technology, and has published widely on artificial intelligence, technology, and military innovation. We're also joined by Dr. Hitoshi Nasu, a professor in the West Point Department of Law and Lieber Institute for Law and Land Warfare. His research is focused on a variety of legal elements around security challenges in the Indo-Pacific and South China Seas in particular. We're also joined by Meia Nouwens, a senior fellow for Chinese defense policy and military modernization at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And last but not least, we are joined by Dr. Sanne Verschuren, the Stanton Nuclear Security Postdoctoral Fellow at Stanford University, whose recent article at War on the Rocks highlights her depth of knowledge on advanced weapon systems, including hypersonic missiles. So without further ado, I will remind you all to please keep your cameras off and microphones muted unless you are speaking, and I will hand the floor over to Major Calhoun. Thank you.
So Max, thank you so much for that introduction and for the invitation to speak at this panel. I've attended a lot of these events myself, and it's really an honor to be on the other side of it presenting today. I think my fellow panelists certainly have more expertise than me, so what I'm going to do is just a little road to war of kind of how we got here, some brief context on hypersonic missiles, and I know one of my later panelist colleagues will go into a lot more depth on this. And then I can talk about what the Department of Defense is doing right now to counter the Chinese threat. So I think a lot of people are familiar with how we've arrived at great power competition, but in short, there's this old Cold War mentality that China was sort of the good communist compared to the Soviet Union. That led to a lot of assumptions that have now proved to be false, that if we brought China into the international liberal world order, that they would democratize, they would open up and become a little bit more innovative, more free at home with civil rights and things like that. And unfortunately, China saw that opening and some of the ambiguity in the post-Cold War world order to really take advantage of a lot of the freedoms that the international organization community order would offer them. So they accumulated a lot of wealth, a really robust economy, and because of their authoritarian system of government, they were able to fuse their government with their military, with their industrial base and means of production. And this is why we've seen in what seemed like over the course of one night, but really the last 20 years when the US and the Western world was focused on the war on terror, China, because of that fusion that they have with the government, military, and means of production, has really created a world-class military organization that right now is at the peer level with the US. They have some overmatch in a couple of key areas that the department is working right now to try to have us regain strategic advantage in. But more than just the military threat, China is also an economic threat. They have entrenched themselves very deeply into the global economy, and they've essentially made themselves so indispensable that if any company were to, or country or company were to try to decouple with China, that's a phrase you may have heard, really it would have a lot of negative impacts. So the way forward, at least economically, is probably not to learn to live without China, but to learn to live with China in a way that still protects our assets and our strategic advantage. So their military modernization not only came about because of their growing economy, but some intellectual property theft that they did. Of course, a lot of espionage against the US government, companies that we contract with, universities and research institutes and think tanks. A lot of that is probably not new to people that have been paying attention in the news. And then we fast forward also to their new national security laws that they imposed in Hong Kong. And the trial this week actually begins for Jimmy Lai, who's the owner of the pro-democracy newspaper, who was arrested for attending a memorial service to Tiananmen Square massacre earlier this summer. So that's kind of all going on in the background. And then we fast forward to October 25th of this year, when the Financial Times reported that China conducted a pretty significant hypersonic missile test. And hypersonic weapons are significant, one, because of their speed. They can travel about a mile a minute, but they also have an incredibly long range, which makes the US homeland no longer protected. The standoff that we've had from the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and past world conflicts really is something that we cannot count on anymore with the hypersonic missiles that China, Russia, and some other adversaries are developing. Additionally, these missiles are highly maneuverable, so they will shoot up into space, where it's harder for us to track them, and then they'll fly at various altitudes that just make it harder for us to track them, harder to interdict, and then have warning as well. So we, on the blue side, are trying to catch up and form our own hypersonic missile, enterprise here. But again, our industrial base is not as tightly tied to the government and the military on the US side as it is on the Chinese side. So that's something that my boss, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, is working to rectify. In addition to the missiles, China is approaching conflict in the same multi-domain operations sense that we are. A lot of you are probably familiar with their cyber efforts, information operations, which are also very closely tied to their diplomacy. They've been flying a lot of fighter jets in and around Taiwan, Japan, some of the other Pacific Island countries, just trying to intimidate them. And then they also use their fishing vessels in kind of a Coast Guard type format for sort of a first initial ring of security. So that paints a pretty dismal picture. And the hope I can offer, though, is that there is a growing bipartisan consensus in DC, and I think throughout the country, in both political parties, both chambers of Congress. You hear the President, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State talking about it. And I think the last national security strategy in 2017 really laid a good framework for that. And this administration is developing its own national security strategy. This department is working on the national defense strategy, but even the initial documents that came out in January and February of this year are very clear about the threat that China poses and our need to respond to it. So my boss, the Deputy Secretary, has China as her #1 priority. She is leading in a lot of efforts for innovation within the department to divest of old legacy systems that are just not going to meet the current threat. And she's written the budget in a way that this is the largest apportionment we've had for research and experimentation in the history of the Department of Defense. And she and the Secretary regularly engage with industry leaders beyond just your Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, companies like that that typically produce things, but we're looking at microchips, other elements that would need to go into missiles, and really building a force that if we did go into a protracted conflict with China, we'd be able to contend with them. And then there's also a lot of work going on with OPSEC and cyber defense to identify vulnerabilities, not just within the military, but also in the commercial sector, like we saw with the Colonial Pipeline. So I will pause there and turn it over to the next panelist.
Thanks so much, Brigid. That was a great rundown. Justin, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, Max, and for the invitation. Like Brigid said, I'm really excited to be here and excited to participate in the conversation today. So I'll focus on how emerging technology is going to affect warfare, with a focus on artificial intelligence. There's a number of significant technologies that are coming to maturity right now. in a way that is, to the best that I can determine, the best of my knowledge, is unprecedented. So the next 10 years are likely to be remembered 100 years from now as a time when technology changed our economy, geopolitics, and national security. And I know you hear some message like that pretty constantly over and over again, but there's a number that are coming to maturity right now in a way that is unusual. I'll focus on AI for the conversation today, or at least my opening remarks, both because it's what I know best and because it's the most mature and likely to be one of, if not the most significant of the technologies that are coming up to maturity now. It's also the technology that the Chinese government and the PLA have said is the key to their economic and military success. They view technology as one of, if not the chief drivers of our competition, and AI is the most important. So to get into a little bit about AI, one way to think about AI is as the industrialization of decision-making. A lot of the 19th and 20th centuries were about industrializing manufacturing by regularizing and automating the manufacturing process. That vastly increased the manufacturing speed, volume, and quality of a lot of products, all reducing their cost with a really significant improvement to our quality of living. AI offers the possibility of doing the same thing for decision-making, as long as we build and effectively use the systems needed. Organizations adopting AI can identify bottlenecks in their decision-making and execution processes, automate them as much as possible, and then move humans to the boundaries of machine capabilities where they'll perform tasks that humans can do more effectively than machines. Once they've done that, they'll be able to use data to make better decisions more quickly and at vastly larger scale than organizations that don't. We've already seen this in e-commerce, the finance industry, advertising, and other areas. Organizations that can make tens of thousands or more of decisions in the time that it would take organizations that have not made this transformation can just operate in a qualitatively different way that's much more effective. So I said we've seen that in large parts of the industry. We've begun and will increasingly see it take place in competitive spaces and warfare. So for the conversation today, how is this going to affect military operations, especially the types of operations the cadets in the audience are likely to encounter? Now, I'll start with a few existing capabilities that AI will expand and optimize. I should note that this is not an all-inclusive list, and apologize for needing to move through the material pretty quickly. So first, targeting for long-range fires will become faster, more precise due to the fusion of many data streams, the use of pattern recognition software on that data to identify targets, and the automation of many parts of the targeting decision-making process. That's going to increase the importance of obscuration, sensor deception, and submerged and subterranean operations. More capable long-range fires may also make it difficult for forces to maneuver, consolidate large formations, which is really often a key component of decisive victories. There's a pretty good article on MWI, actually, this week about that topic. Information operations, including cyber operations, electronic warfare, PSYOPs, and some intelligent functions are going to increasingly take place at machine speeds and scales, both for offense and defensive operations. Common operating pictures will be less limited by staff capacity and will increasingly become the product of the automated fusion of multiple inputs, and will use pattern recognition to find regularities and irregularities in data streams to dynamically select information for integration and display. That sounds like really boring stuff that will make a few staffers excited because they'll be able to sleep more often, but it's actually going to have a huge change on leaders' ability to process information and make decisions effectively and to do so really quickly. And that'll affect a lot about battle rhythms in the targeting lifecycle as well. And then many business processes and logistics are also going to be automated. That's possibly the least cool thing I'll say on purpose today, but it'll save DoD a lot of time and money, both of which can then be redirected into operations and R&D. I was going to make a joke about redirecting funding into the West Point mess to get better food, but like I can't see anybody on the screen, so I don't know if that joke would land flat or not. So anyway, so with those existing capabilities, AI is also going to enable us to create new capabilities, which is where many of the most interesting changes are going to take place over the next few years. So first off, AI is going to enable what we'll call widespread persistent surveillance, where you're constantly being monitored, and almost everyone is. Some of that's going to come through the AI-enabled automation of traditional collection and analysis, but data collection by and about personal electronic devices and vehicles, financial information, online behavior, Wi-Fi sensors, and growing genetic databases are also going to contribute. Private sector companies they've monetized collection analysis of it, but they've also developed algorithms that may be able to use this data to predict a person's personality and behavior more effectively than close family members. Imagine what could be done with detailed profiles of most political and military leaders in a state. That's going to also enable we'll call micro-targeting at scale, or the tailored targeting of a large number of specific people with both kinetic and non-kinetic effects to achieve specific outcomes, with hundreds or thousands of people having tailored actions taken against them. I'll just briefly mention the last two capabilities, autonomous swarms and modeling and simulation with AI-enabled wargames, both of which have the potential to be very, very disruptive, and I can talk about it a little bit more in the Q&A session if they're interesting. So altogether, those developments will lead to 4 qualitative changes to warfare that the cadets in our audience are likely to encounter in their careers. First, data collection and management are going to become much more important, both to make our systems function, to train models, to feed the models so they can make decisions, and to keep our adversaries from collecting effective data about you. Data collection and management is a tactical skill. In that vein, peacetime surveillance has already become more important. Data collected in peacetime, even with benign intent or by American companies, can enable adversaries to make useful assessments or to predict behavior or to get inside their targeting. Third, and related to the first two, is that warfare will become increasingly individualized. So historically, achieving some sort of strategic effect usually required threatening or destroying a significant component of a military or threatening important state resources. With micro-targeting at scale and some of the other capabilities you mentioned, it's possible to achieve strategic effects by persuading, coercing, or killing a small number of critical personnel. Notably, this can likely be done without any formal declaration of war or even conflict. So this effect may actually be pretty invisible to the nation that it's being done to. Fourth, the ability to design systems that will augment or perform human roles, then to delegate authority to them responsibly will become as important as marksmanship, writing orders, or operating a vehicle, which is a bold statement, but I think accurate. So I'll stop there for now. Thanks again for having me, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thanks, Justin. A lot of really interesting and sometimes bleak points, at least from my perspective, on monitoring and surveillance, but really a lot to think of in terms of the individualization of war and the use of big data and AI for war. So looking forward to discussing that more in Q&A. Professor Nasu, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks Dr. McGillis for organizing this event and then his team. So my remarks are focused on Taiwan. So I think many of the people in this audience would be familiar with the Chinese posture against Taiwan. The position is that Taiwan is part of China, and the unification of Taiwan and integrating them into mainland China is the ultimate goal the current leadership of the Communist Party of China is pursuing. On the other hand, Taiwan is more schizophrenic in terms of their approach to mainland China. There's a sort of division of views. So there are some people who are in favor of seeing some sort of unification with mainland China, perhaps in a peaceful manner at some point, whereas other people want to see more sort of independent, autonomous status from China. And the current president, Tsai Ing-wen, is the person who is sort of leading the latter approach, trying to advocate that Taiwan is a sort of equal partner at the equal level to mainland China. Recent remarks she made about Taiwan not being subordinate to one another is really illustrating that approach. So in this brief remarks, I would focus on the possible US military involvement in situations where China decides to launch some sort of assault against Taiwan to take control over it. And there are 3 legal options to help the US authorities in justifying the defense of Taiwan. Now, perhaps before I get into this, from Chinese perspective, it's quite simple. The legal situation here is quite simple. Taiwan is part of China, and therefore any interference by our external powers, including the US, is an unlawful intervention into domestic affairs of China. So that's as simple as that. So any interference we may undertake with the affairs with Taiwan would be seen as a breach of international legal obligations at different levels. But there are some legal options that are available for us to justify action or military involvement in defense of Taiwan. And that's important in the eyes of the international community. There will be a lot of sympathy to China, particularly those countries that have a more autocratic regime, and the issues of minority groups and separate groups trying to achieve some sort of autonomous status or even independence. So a good justification, legal justification, is an important consideration for the US authorities in deciding what to do with the situation that may evolve in Taiwan. First of all, we must not forget that in situations of Chinese sort of invasion, so-called invasion of Taiwan, would involve a lot of military assets. And those military assets, some of them may actually threaten the US assets around deployed in the region. So in the case there is an attack or imminent attack that is launched against the US assets deployed in the region, the US has its own right of self-defense. So on that basis, the US can justify its military use, its use of force against China to defend ourselves and our assets within the region. Now, of course, because it's a self-defense of the US assets, its use of force is limited to the extent necessary and proportionate to fend off that threat coming from China. The second option is in justification is the use of force in situations where we conduct non-combatant evacuation operation. As you can imagine, if there is any assault to take over Taiwan, there will be hostilities, there are hostile activities taking place in the mainland of in Taiwan. That means that there are a lot of civilians and non-combatants that are affected by the war fighting. So obviously, there are lots of US residents and residents of other nations, friendly nations for us. And obviously, there is a need to coordinate, to evacuate and assist the evacuation of those non-combatants. So obviously, the non-combatant evacuation operation will be limited to the evacuation and assistance for those who are trapped in the battlefield. But nonetheless, those who are involved in the operation would have their own right of self-defense under the rules of engagement. And that rules of engagement, self-defense, may even extend to the defense of others who are being affected by an attack launched by a Communist Party or PLA. Again, this is a more limited option because it's limited to the self-defense, so defense of themselves or this, other people in their care. So the extent to which they can justify military action is obviously limited, but nonetheless, that's a justifiable legal option and a justification we can provide. The third option is the state of belligerency. It's a very old doctrine. Nowadays, it's really rarely used. But in the old days, it was quite a useful concept diplomatically to recognize certain entity within another state as a sort of a belligerent party to an armed conflict and provide some assistance. In fact, that was the position British took during the American Civil War when there was a fighting between the Union forces and the Confederate forces. Great Britain took a neutral position by acknowledging or recognizing Confederacy as a belligerent state. We could do the same with regard to Taiwan. The US at the moment is maintaining the strategic ambiguity in terms of the status of Taiwan. We don't recognize Taiwan as an independent state. And therefore, we cannot claim the exercise of the right of collective self-defense because we are not really defending another sovereign state that is under an attack. Instead, we are treating Taiwan as sort of part of China, although an independent entity. So we can recognize Taiwan as a belligerent party in situations where there's a hostility between the Communist Party of mainland and the Taiwanese authorities. And on that basis, we could allow our companies, the US companies and other weapons suppliers to provide commercial service in support of Taiwan's effort to fend off an attack or the invasion from China. Now, as long as the assistance is limited to private commerce, that's not a problem. But when we recognize Taiwan as a belligerent state, the obligation we have is the obligation of neutrality. We have to maintain a neutral position towards each of those parties. That means that the extent to which we can provide assistance for Taiwan in favor of Taiwan through our governmental links is rather limited. If we provide military assistance, that may be seen as a breach of our obligations as a neutral state. Now, obviously, that may be a breach. Of course, we can argue that that's not a breach. But even in the case where such assistance is seen as a breach of our legal obligation as a neutral state, it doesn't necessarily mean that we would have to take the responsibility for it. The question is whether China could have an adequate venue to bring the case against the US for a violation of those neutral obligations. So given that it's quite unlikely that China would be able to find an avenue to launch a litigation against the US for a violation of neutral obligations, US may actually conduct a various range of military assistance in defense of Taiwan. So that's the sort of third option that is available, legally available, to justify a US military involvement in defense of Taiwan.
Thank you, Professor Nasu. Great to hear such a detailed breakdown of the legal options, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about the extent to which conflict with China might play out in the legal sphere or through lawfare in Q&A. All right, we are now on to Meia Nouwens. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Max, and thanks also to the organization for having me here today. So very quickly, I'll talk a little bit about military modernization practice and what this means, improvement in progress, and what this means for Taiwan. And so, of course, the starting point to all of this is that it's clear that military modernization reforms have a lot to do with Taiwan. They have a lot to do with reversing the failures of the PLA within the third Taiwan Strait crisis in the late 1990s or mid 1990s. And of course, there's a couple of progress points of military modernization that the PLA is currently focused on, from 2020 to 2035 and 2049, with a midway point that we're currently working towards from a Beijing perspective in 2027. And these, of course, are capability related, but they're also related to, I would argue, geographic priorities, whereby until 2027 to 2035, we see a focus on regional power projection capabilities and replacing the United States as the main military and security actor in the region. And by 2049, looking more at a PLA that plays a global role. Now, when it comes to Taiwan, the PLA are preparing, we think, for 4 scenarios that are more likely that encompass both coercion and counter-intervention strategies. In terms of coercion, these include joint missile campaigns or a blockade that could prevent the trade and resupply with and of Taiwan. In terms of counter-intervention, we of course see a particular role against US and allied forces for the PLA Air Force, Navy, and Rocket Force, as well as SSF, of course, to keep the United States at bay by targeting US and other air and maritime assets. And lastly, of course, there's the big scenario of a potential invasion of Taiwan proper, Whether or not that comes with salami slicing of smaller islands around Taiwan in the lead up to that is still a question. But the big scenario, of course, is whether or not there'll be an effort to capitulate the Taiwanese government into accepting unification by force through a PLA amphibious assault on the main island of Taiwan. Now, the PLA, of course, is building capabilities for these ranges of scenarios, and we see improvements to that end in C2 structures within theater commands, but also, of course, across theater commands and with the Central Military Commission at the very top directing everything, including a significant force, of course, on joint operational concepts and capabilities and cross-theater command coordination. This, of course, encompasses progress with regards to missile capabilities and quality, amphibious and C4ISR capabilities, and more offensive Air Force postures as well. And in addition to all of that, if it wasn't enough, of course, a really ambitious military shipbuilding effort too. Now, these capabilities, of course, don't just widen the military imbalance across the Taiwan Strait, but also within the wider region, with many regional countries currently feeling the brunt of increased PLA assertiveness, not just PLA, but of course within the PLA, the leveraging of other forces such as the Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia, which now fall within the command and control structures of the PLA. Now, as I said, these military capabilities are being built to keep the US and other countries at bay that might come to Taiwan's aid, and in order to change their risk calculus for doing so. And to maintain an advantage, Beijing will likely leverage its ability to control the timing and surprise of any move on Taiwan in an effort to preempt external military support for the island. However, the more countries that, of course, warn caution to Beijing and support for the status quo or discuss the importance of Taiwan for national security considerations, such as Japan has done, the more complicated this picture becomes for Beijing, which, of course, doesn't believe in alliances and likely will act alone. The question then is, will we see an attempt at reunification by force in the immediate future? And the answer is that none of us can know. But of course, some considerations are worth taking into account. The first of this being that the military consideration is just one factor of this equation. She has been quite clear about using all options on the table and to not pass on this Taiwan problem from generation to generation. And there's thus an inherent sense of legacy in terms of his calculating when it comes to potentially unifying Taiwan with the mainland by force. This is something that he wants sorted, apparently, from his statements, and the success of that, if we to believe him to be true, should be attributable to him at the end of the day. And with regards to military considerations, we glean conflicting reviews from the Chinese media at present. On the one hand, there's the overconfident and over-belligerent, often belligerent sources like the Global Times, which warn of sped-up modernization efforts and imminent threats to Taiwan. On the other hand, of course, we also glean commentaries and opinions from PLA high-ranking officials or PLA-related sources that the PLA hasn't yet advanced enough to make sufficient gains for such operations just yet. And think here, for example, of ongoing PLA amphibious assault capabilities and anti-submarine warfare capabilities as well. Add to that, of course, the question of how far jointness has come within the PLA, and I'm thinking here of, in particular, the question of whether jointness is actually reflected within the force. At the moment, I believe that all PLA theater commanders are currently headed by a theater commander from the PLA Army. And that isn't necessarily, I think, what Xi Jinping had in mind when he had jointness planted as a firm goal for the PLA. And there are, of course, more issues within the PLA that we can touch upon within the Q&A that, of course, are important to consider. Nevertheless, there is political will, of course, and a whole-of-nation effort to bring the PLA up to speed for a Taiwan scenario first and foremost. And so that shouldn't be disregarded despite the potential hurdles within the PLA. I would argue that lastly, it is important to consider the non-military questions or considerations around forcing a unification with Taiwan. Here, both domestic political and economic consequences are important to keep in mind from Beijing's perspective. With regards to the former, the question might loom of what failure regarding an attempt to retake Taiwan might look like for the PLA and for the CCP. If a return to the status quo is not achieved following a failed attempt, then what might be palatable? For example, what does that mean for CCP legitimacy back home? And I think that's a really big question that we need to keep in mind. And secondly, of course, in addition to how the United States might respond militarily, how other like-minded countries respond non-militarily is also important. So a former PLA general was quoted last year as stating that attempting to challenge the United States at the moment would be akin to throwing all of China's eggs in a basket and tossing that out the window. And I think the reference is to whether or not China is willing to currently waste all of the progress that it sees it has made in terms of economic and political gain in the last few decades over Taiwan. And here, of course, whether or not we respond to Taiwan, both militarily but also economically, is important to keep in mind. What economic cost would Beijing be willing to incur, both in the short term, the medium term, and the long term, if it does fail a Taiwan scenario, or indeed achieve a Taiwan unification? And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you so much. What a helpful complement to Professor Nasu's comments on what is bound to be one of the hottest and most dangerous and most controversial issues in American security in the region. So very much looking forward to picking that up again after our final speaker's comments. Last and certainly not least, Dr. Verschuren, we are eager to hear from you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much for having me today. It's a real honor to be able to speak to all of you on these very important questions. So what I will do is I'll briefly summarize the article that I just published in War on the Rocks, which kind of tackles the hypersonic missile question and the missile defense side of it. So let me start. So hypersonics, I would argue, do not really change the strategic calculus in the way that we often say it does. China is not the only country in the world that is currently pursuing hypersonic missiles. China, Russia, and the United States are all doing it at the moment, albeit with mixed success, and it is not a new phenomena. In the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union both had projects in the 1960s to develop hypersonics, but abandoned them later on. So hypersonics are often said to be incredibly fast. They travel at more than 5 times the speed of sound. But if we compare hypersonics to ballistic missiles fly up to 20 times more the speed of sound. And so over the entire flight, ballistic missiles are actually faster than hypersonic missiles. They also are said to fly at lower altitudes than ballistic missiles, which fly according to a parabolic trajectory. Which means that radars would have a harder time picking them up. But hypersonics are still tractable. So for example, we could think about the space-based infrared sensors that the United States currently operates. These could trace the burnout from the missiles when they're launched, for example. And then finally, hypersonics are often said to be more maneuverable are more maneuverable than ballistic missiles, which fly along a fixed trajectory. But even the 2019 Missile Defense Review recognized that U.S. missile defenses, are only capable of intercepting a small barrage of unsophisticated intercontinental ballistic missiles from states like North Korea. But why is then this hypersonic tests from China actually a problem? So I would argue that hypersonic missiles are part of a broader move among all the nuclear powers in the world to modernize their nuclear arsenals and add all sorts of new and potentially destabilizing capabilities to their military toolkits. This new arms race, which is unconstrained by arms control, is especially problematic for at least 2 reasons. So the first one is the increased intertwinedness between the nuclear and the conventional worlds, thinking about, for example, dual-use capabilities. There's also very few formal and informal channels of communication between the United States and China, which in times of crisis could be really, really worrisome. So what is driving this nuclear modernization and the fact that Russia, China, and other countries are adding all these kinds of capabilities like hypersonics to their nuclear arsenals? So I would argue that U.S. missile defenses have played an important role here, and particularly the ever-expanding nature of U.S. missile defenses. So on one hand, the declaratory policy of US missile defenses is that China and Russia will be deterred through the United States nuclear arsenal. But at the same time, there is constant contradictory statements. So for example, the 2019 MDR does hint at the fact that maybe missile defense should be expanded to deal with the Chinese and Russian threat. And when Donald Trump announced the missile defense review, he did say that it could tackle all threats. So I think that there is like a little slippage in the declaratory policy. In addition, we've seen a really big buildup of capabilities, and there is a potential for a return to space-based interceptors, which are again described in policy. And then thirdly, the idea of homeland missile defenses has kind of been exported by the United States to different regions of the world. I think, for example, about the European phased adaptive approach in Europe, the Asian Pacific infrastructure. All of this together gives the idea that US missile defense is going to expand forever and ever beyond what was initially the policy set up in 2001 when these capabilities were first developed. And China and Russia have said at multiple instances that they think this is incredibly worrisome. So particularly China, for example, is worried that the United States might be able to take out its second strike capability. And so what should we do with this? So I think that in this conversation, the strategic implications and particularly the way in which US missile defenses, which are aimed at North Korea and Iran, in the way in which they have implications for the relationship with Russia and China. And I think this should be addressed in three ways. So first, it would be helpful to have more conversations in US Congress around the strategic implications of missile defense. Second, in the current nuclear posture review and the missile defense review, it would be good to build sufficient linkages between both conversations that are happening. And third, missile defense should be on the table for strategic conversations with Russia and potentially in the future with China. And specifically, I see two areas here. So there should be a clear declaratory policy about what missile defense can and cannot do, or should and should not do. And there should also be proposals on the table about limiting this ever-expansive mission of missile defense. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of our panelists. We are right on time. We have around 30 minutes for question and answers. I will take the moderator's privilege to ask the first one and to give everyone in the audience time to think of any questions they might have. So if you do have a question, please just use the hand raise function. If you're having any trouble with that, send us a message in the chat, but I will do my best to go by hands raised that I see on a first come, first served basis. So my first question for anyone on the panel, since we've heard about so many different issues facing American-Chinese relations today, what is the biggest threat or limitation to the American ability to deter China today? And I know that's intentionally broad. What is the biggest deterrent challenge today?
I think it's too broad. I think I need a couple of hours to think about that and what is the biggest sort of a deterrence. I think the problem is coming from China, not really from us. The perception that they can win this, they can outweigh the US powers. Even though it may be illusionary, there are some who really take the firm view that China is winning and then taking over various issues, global issues. That's one. Taiwan is very, very a specific issue, but it's sort of entangled in this global competition. So obviously we have to separate those issues, but nonetheless they're entangled because it's a sort of a test case for how this great power competition may actually play out in a small scale, in a limited regional domain.
Thank you. Justin?
Yeah, thanks. To add to that a little bit, I don't know if this is the biggest one, because that's the hardest part of the question, is what's the biggest issue for deterrence, but this is certainly a major one. There's a strong perception within the CCP and other parts of China that the United States is a declining power. And they can point to specific reasons why they believe we're a declining power, coming from some things with our economy, including the 2008 financial crisis and some of the things that were mismanaged leading up to that and then after that. And then more recently, issues with our response to COVID, which was markedly different than just about anywhere else in the world, certainly in the developed world. And then in the manner in which we withdrew from Afghanistan, though not necessarily the withdrawal from Afghanistan itself.
Come out to decide that we are not subordinate to one another. I think it's partly explained by that consolidated status or the support she now enjoys as a result of what the public now knows about what may happen, what would follow if Chinese authorities take any control over any part of Taiwan. So certainly, in terms of the sort of message the Chinese sent to Taiwan through that event, certainly there has been quite an impact on it. Although I don't think it has eliminated the sort of other view, the more unification, those who are in favor of unification, and their position. But nonetheless, I think there has been a significant impact, psychological impact on a lot of Taiwanese mind.
Thank you, Meia.
Thanks. I fully agree with that statement from Dr. Nasu, but I just add two things. Before we saw the protests in Hong Kong and the national security law, the DPP and popularity ratings for President Tsai were actually on the down. So in that sense, the DPP actually received a significant boost in popularity from the Taiwanese public. And it's by no means, I think, that by no means guaranteed. I think that Tsai and the DPP will remain, their popularity ratings will remain as high as they currently are. The other factor that, of course, we have to take into consideration here is the KMT, the Kuomintang Party, which, of course, I think has been not aided by what's happened in Hong Kong, but also cannot find a new position for itself within Taiwanese politics that isn't purely pro-mainland and pro-unification focused, but also isn't pro-independence. And certainly the recent elections of the new KMT leader also haven't really helped. And we've seen flip-flopping of former of course, KMT President Ma Ying-jeou in his statements with regards to what he thinks about one country, two systems, and the relationship that Taiwan should have with mainland China. So here the KMT, I think, is really stuck between a rock and a hard place, and whether they'll come out of it is uncertain. But on the other hand, that camp does still remain to a certain extent, I think, within the more conservative business portions of or sectors of Taiwan society, and of course the older generations in Taiwan as well. So we can't forget that, as Dr. Nasu made clear.
Thank you. I have another signaling question while we wait for additional audience questions. How much should we make of this switch in rhetoric from the United States from great power competition to strategic competition? What do we think the idea behind that is, and what message might China be reading into that?
Yeah, I think at least here in the DoD, words obviously have a lot of different meanings, right? So the way that you message things is incredibly significant, especially when you talk about it happening up at the strategic level. It's something that we look at for how we message, but then we're of course focused on how China's messaging, how our allies and partners are messaging too. And I think there is a sense, any administration changeover, you kind of want to put your own stamp on stuff. So great power competition certainly came into vogue in the last administration. And as we move into the new administration, there's, I think, just a natural desire to try to put your own mark on certain things. But I think looking at strategic competition specifically, though, doesn't necessarily close as many doors as the moniker great power would. When you think of that, China, Russia, United States come to mind. But we can't neglect the strategic capabilities and impacts that countries like North Korea, Iran, even things that are devolving in Ethiopia and Sudan right now, those all compete for different strategic capabilities that we have. So I think changing it to strategic competition just creates a more broad scope of how we view the world, we view some of these problems. And it also is part of how we message to the American people, right? You know, China has this whole of nation, whole of government approach. We are trying to sensitize the American people, the American industrial base, to the fact that this could be a long and projected conflict. So if we can get the rest of our population to think beyond just Russia and China, and you know, who else is the next sleeping China that might be coming up in 20 and 30 years, I think we need to have that shift in mindset and perhaps not, you know, block ourselves off to additional threats that could be out there.
From a fairly academic perspective on this, and very much agreeing with what Brigid had to say. Also, great power competition has a pretty strong background in history. That means to a lot of people, especially people who care very deeply about what specific things mean, it means things like what we saw in World War I and World War II, where we were great power competition focused on things like being able to seize land and other types of natural resources. And while that's not necessarily not a feature of the competitions we're seeing right now, it goes well past that into things like platforms, communications, changing the ways people speak, and to some extent with that, the way people think, a lot of other things that are not a feature, or were not a feature of great power competitions in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. So I don't have a particular strong opinion about the shift from great power to strategic, but I think it does remove some of the academic debates that we might have about whether or not great power competition is appropriate for what we're seeing today.
Really helpful perspectives. Thank you. Love to get some questions from cadets. Any brave cadets? While they're mustering courage, I'd love to hear the group's thoughts on Dr. Verschuren. You touched on this a little bit with respect to arms control, but what are the possibilities, or does anybody else in the room have thoughts on the possibilities for bilateral or multilateral agreements as a mechanism of de-escalation, whether in arms control or whether there's any other issues that might be more promising in that, using that strategy?
Yeah, so I think, I think it is really important to pursue conversations with both China and Russia. I think this should be a big priority. I do think that that missile defense is an integral part of those kinds of conversations, and the US being willing to talk about missile defense will be a key step to ensuring some kind of successful progress in these conversations. So I think, and I also think that in the United States itself, right, I think that there is very, very different views on what missile defense is and what the role of missile defense should be, both in the peer context, but also in the non-peer context. So I think there are openings for discussing this, but it will be an integral part of any conversation moving forward. And I think what we've seen in the past, where it was often pushed off the negotiation table, or it was like really like kind of a red line, I think that is no longer a successful strategy.
My understanding is that the US has been open, and I think there are a lot of sort of opportunities between Russia and the US to talk about it. The problem is that China has been just resisting to join the talk. So that's the problem. Yes, it'd be ideal if we have some sort of a trilateral agreement. But unless China comes on board, then nothing can happen. But in addition, when it comes to this supersonic, yes, supersonic itself may be a problem, but what was problematic with that test is the use of space vehicle. as the launching pad for this hypersonic missile. We have an existing law under the Outer Space Treaty. The states are prohibited from placing in orbit any vehicle that carries or is capable of carrying nuclear weapons or any other weapons of mass destruction. Now, what China did test was actually that very capability. Now, of course, there is a question as to whether the partial orbit or use of partial orbit, not full orbit, itself is a violation of that particular obligation. But that illustrates the problem. Even if we have some sort of agreement, China is going to violate it, and they would pretend that they didn't violate it. Even this test, they deny that they actually conducted such a test. They claim that this is a peaceful test, testing their capabilities of reusing rockets. That's their claim. So unless we can settle or resolve this fundamental sort of trust issue between the states, no agreement will be able to sort out this problem.
To add one more bit to this, one of the areas that's going to be very interesting for arms control discussions, successful or not, is how we approach arms control for digital systems. There's a strong precedent for how we have arms control negotiations and inspections for things like hypersonics, and so there's a strong basis for it. But increasingly, we're seeing control systems or weapons that are simply software, like cyber weapons, for instance, that there's an interest in figuring out how we can have some sort of international regulation on them. And the reason that that's a particularly interesting topic is because it's actually very difficult to do that, partially because of a definition question. What is a weapon? What isn't a weapon? When is something a weapon versus just a normal part of espionage for the cyber realm? When is something autonomous or not autonomous? People will spend entire careers debating those topics, which is fun, but not necessarily needed for full arms control. But the other pieces of it that are challenges is that software is essentially invisible from the outside. How can you determine if a system is autonomous, semi-autonomous, or being remotely operated from the exterior? Or there's just a degree of luck there. Sometimes that can be difficult, sometimes it's more obvious. Another part for some systems is attribution. Understanding if, as was just said, if they actually just violated your arms control agreement and then blame it on somebody else, which is easier in cyber weapons than it is in many other areas. And then doing the follow-up inspections, which are a key part of any arms control regime, is especially difficult with software because they tend to be highly classified, and it would be even more of a breach of sovereignty or a violation of sovereignty to say, not only do we want to do inspections, which is a normal part of many arms control regimes, but we want to see the software in your systems. That's so closely held that would be very difficult to implement. So I certainly am not saying that this is impossible to do or it isn't something that should be attempted, but there are some challenges that we need to figure out with our competitors, how we can work through that if we want to do it successfully.
Thanks, Justin. Very well said. We have a question from Benjamin Elliott.
Yeah, thanks for taking the question. Fascinating brief today from the group. The question I was wondering or curious about kind of is the red line perspective of U.S. forces in Taiwan. Coming from Indo-PACOM, there had always been kind of a unwritten understanding that a possible potential red line for U.S. or for Chinese intervention in Taiwan would be the presence of U.S. forces. And with the news reports out of the Wall Street Journal earlier last month, about a month ago at this time, of U.S. Special Forces having been in there for a considerable amount of time. I was just curious of the group's understanding kind of now of what that means or what that should mean for the CCP going forward. Thanks.
Again, it's a great question, Benjamin. I'm sure that you're having a great party there. Yes, the red line. It's a curious thing. It's sort of an unwritten understanding. I think there was also a Chinese version of it. I haven't really seen the actual document, but I understand is sort of similar red line document in Chinese as well. Now, of course, it's unwritten. It's all sort of shaped by what we do and then what we demonstrate as how we understand it. So obviously, any sort of a big move from, for example, the US government officially recognizing Taiwan as an independent state. That sort of big step may actually trigger some sort of a hostile reaction from China. But I think in reality, it would be a much more nuanced change, and accumulation of those nuanced change that would shift the red line over time. I think the obvious concern, what we might actually see in response from China is some sort of action. I think someone mentioned salami slicing strategy previously. So there's a concern that there's a little island called Platus Island between China, mainland China, and Taiwan that may be used as sort of a test case by the Chinese authorities and see how the US might react to it. That's sort of a nuanced minor event. We have to keep an eye on it, and we have to be prepared to respond in appropriate manner so that we don't escalate the conflict. But at the same time, we show how we would react to Chinese action against Taiwan or any other perhaps areas. But I think that's sort of an accumulation of small events that would determine the course of events into the future.
Meia.
So I agree, it's a great question, but I would argue that for the PLA, there's 6 conditions that they've put out, right, that discuss a rationale for for Beijing to intervene in Taiwan, and they range from foreign troops in Taiwan to capability development, but also I think importantly declarations of independence. And then I think a 4th one also includes whether or not there is domestic instability in Taiwan, whereby Beijing would intervene and save Taiwan from itself, so to speak. So I think there's a range of different scenarios, and I think this interestingly calls China's bluff a little bit if it didn't already know that this was taking place in Taiwan. And I have my questions about that. Whether or not this is really such a shock to Beijing and the CMC. But it does, I think, point to another issue that we have with the CCP considerations and calculations around Taiwan, which is that it says one thing, but what the CCP says isn't always, of course, what it does or what it means. And so what could be stated as a red line could, at the end of the day, suddenly not mean a red line, or what wasn't considered a red line might mean a red line. Now, considering, as I said in my presentation, how I think Beijing currently looks towards, or its risk calculation that it has towards a Taiwan invasion or a forced unification using military means, I don't actually think that risk calculation has necessarily changed because of the Wall Street Journal article. So in that sense, I don't think it necessarily changes anything too quickly or too drastically just yet.
Thanks, Meia. We are almost out of time, but since I did encourage cadets to ask some questions, we do have one question in the chat that I think will be our last one for the day. So if the U.S. military, together with partner forces, is superior to the PLA, what changes or what does the United States need to do differently in terms of current posturing and deployment of American forces to reassert American military superiority in the eyes of CCP leadership? Or does the CCP not recognize the United States, or do they already recognize the U.S. as superior?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and we need to consider what the present perception is versus what the perception in reality will be, 5, 10, 15 years from now, right? As Meia explained, the PLA and CCP have their benchmark milestones of capabilities that are tied with some geopolitical goals as well. So there's what it could be, today on November 8th versus in a month from now. What it might be. I certainly think our network of allies and partners is a strategic advantage that we do have. The AUKUS agreement that was just announced is a very significant step in the right direction. We certainly need Australia and then even Japan, which we've begun some more bilateral agreements with. And to the earlier question of bilateral and multilateral engagement, I think on the friendly side of it, that is the way that we're going to move forward, especially as we've seen the international organizations fail us in a lot of ways. It's going to be trying to find groups of like-minded people on certain issues or in certain regions of the world that will move forward. And we've talked about too the Chinese perception of the Afghanistan withdrawal. I think they acknowledged that was, in their view, a strategic embarrassment, strategic failure for the United States. But they also know that the more disengaged we become from the CENTCOM area of responsibility, the more that we'll be able to focus on the Pacific. And of course, Putin might be doing a couple things right now to try to distract us a little bit more from that. And I think that plays into their considerations, for Taiwan and the red lines as well. What else is going to be going on in the world that U.S. forces are committed to that affect their calculus of our risk and our willingness to put people in there? So, if the bad people of the world wanted to get together and kind of collude on each making some land grabs and everything, that would certainly create multiple crises that the U.S. would have to contend with at once. So I think that's something we shouldn't overlook either.
Thanks, Brigid. And thank you, Cadet Sarf, for your really important question that really ties, is really fundamental to thinking about these larger issues about deterrence and red lines as well. Sorry, Justin, did you have one last thought?
I'm good to go. Thank you.
Good to go. All right, good. Because I know we are closing in on the end of time. I'm sure cadets have additional classes to get to, and everyone else has additional things in their busy days today. So with that, I want to very much thank our audience for coming and for your excellent questions. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for your diverse and expert views on such an important topic. Please keep an eye out on our website and our social media platforms. We will be posting the recording at some point very soon, and we hope to see you again at our next event. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, have a great day.
Thank you.